few amber clouds floated in the sky without a breath of air to move them. The horizon was of a fine golden tint, changing gradually into a pure apple green, and from that into the deep blue of the mid-heaven. A slanting ray lingered on the woody crests of the precipices that overhung some parts of the river, giving greater depth to the dark gray and purple of the rocky sides. A slope was loitering in the distance, dropping slowly down with the tide, her sail hanging uselessly against the mast.
One, there's enough brutality there to build on real ghost stories. There's a very famous ghost story in the southern Hudson Valley where the ghost of a woman haunts the countryside, and in fact, it comes out of a story of a guy who killed his young wife to have an affair because he wanted to marry somebody else. And this ghost story is that her ghost continued to haunt that house and him for the rest of his days, and so people still see that ghost. This woman who was murdered by her husband. He was never convicted of it, never even tried for it, I think. So there was enough ghost stories. There's enough death and dying and horrible things. Indians killing whites in gruesome ways during some of the Anglo-European and Indian wars in the 17th and 18th centuries. That kind of fuels those ghost stories, but also the physical geography of that part of the country, the southern Hudson Valley.
Why is that?
Pardon?
Why is?
Well, it's just it's an
geography?
alien place to the English and to the Dutch. It doesn't look anything like any place they've ever seen. The cliffs that are, I think they're just north of Tarrytown, kind of on the other side of the river where West Point is.
There's some white cliff.
There's some, not white cliffs, but high cliffs. They might be white, I can't remember. But it's something unlike they had seen. The twists and turns, the craggy peaks, the valleys, the kind of teeming wilderness of it all.
If ever I should wish for a retreat, whether I might steal from the world and its distractions, I know of none more promising than this little valley. Some say that the place was bewitched by a high German doctor, others that an old Indian chief, the prophet or wizard, held his powwows there before the country was discovered by Master Hendrik Hudson. The place still continues under the sway of some witching powers that hold a spell over the minds of the good people, causing them to walk in the continual reverie. They are given to all kinds of marvelous beliefs, are subject to trances and visions, and frequently see strange sights and hear music and voices in the air.
Places like that. In other words, there were a lot more people practicing a lot more religion, or different kinds of religion in places like New York and Pennsylvania than they were in other places. Pennsylvania was established, for example, as a religiously free society. New York wasn't necessarily free initially religiously, but it was over time. And as a result, you had Scots-Irish practicing their brand of religion. You had Dutch Reformed churches, Presbyterian churches, Palatinate Germans who moved into the region who were Anabaptists, I think. Baptists, Anabaptists believe in adult baptism, Baptists really believe in infant baptism. Right. If you looked at a map of the Hudson Valley, especially the southern Hudson Valley, northern Hudson Valley, right in that area, and started picking out the churches, you could pick out 7 or 8 different denominations, denominational churches, I guess,
So
in
what?
a relatively small geographic space, and that really influenced. It provided people a kind of cultural base. So tenants who were largely Dutch or who practiced the Dutch Reform saw themselves as different from somebody who practiced, say, Scottish-style Presbyterianism.
Okay.
The revolution, in some respects, and Rip Van Winkle's experience shows this, doesn't do away with those, but it helps people see across those barriers. So where religion really informed people's cultural and local identity before the revolution, it continued to inform their local and cultural identity after the revolution, but it also reinforced the fact that, reinforced their belief that they could do all the things that they wanted to do without fear of the witches and all of the sprites and all of the spell casting takes place in the woods. And in fact, it takes place in all of that stuff takes place in the woods, and all of Shakespeare's plays. Yeah, even today. Right. But the kind of wildness of it allowed them to kind of see the world and maybe see a world that they didn't understand. But it also allowed them to practice things, or to kind of ascribe behavior to people who live there that they hadn't seen before. Where witches practiced magic. It was a place where men weren't like men. They didn't behave like people. It's the world where Christianity confronted the uncivilized world of Indians. Where Protestantism had a hard time kind of gouging it, kind of stuffing itself into. But they were very careful about it, right? There's this world, this other world that we in the 18th century, for example, one of the things that we see over the course of the century is the rise of something called rough music, where people get together in crowds and attack members of their community who had violated what they perceived to be standards of behavior. So they would beat up adulterers or bigamists or something like that. The reason they resorted to that level of violence is because the normal channels through which these people often or had been punished were closed now. Courts were too expensive. You had to pay to have somebody prosecuted in Columbia, New York, for something like bigamy. And if you're poor or poorer, you don't have the money to do that kind of thing. It's just easier to beat the guy up, or to beat the woman up and humiliate them publicly. And it serves as a lesson to everybody else. This is what happens to bigamists. This is what happens to adulterers.
So they were doing the same thing that that was happening in Europe, just towards different kinds of people.
Yes, exactly. They did it in Europe for much the same reason, though, too.
Yeah.
Right? They attacked bread makers who charge too much, bakers who charge too much money. Again, it's a kind of restoring of social order, of normative behavior. The Headless Horseman is an extension of that. He's an otherworldly, a kind of supernatural power who punished people.
Sleepy Hollow was called that because it was so quiet and tranquil that it lured people to sleep. The area is said to have a drowsy, dreamy influence on people, which seemed to make them more susceptible to fantasies associated with the night. Many of the inhabitants accepted the idea that the place was bewitched and believed in the local stories about various supernatural happenings. Although they accepted these wild superstitions, they do not seem to be unduly frightened. In general, the area seems to have a very laid-back, comfortable atmosphere, which allows the story to describe supernatural events without having them seem terrifying.
Irving was trying to capture how people felt about themselves after the American Revolution as opposed to before it. So before the Revolution, New Yorkers especially felt a particular way about themselves and saw themselves in a particular way in relationship to, say, Britain or political power. In the post-revolutionary period, they saw themselves in a very different light. They had a very different relationship to political power in the post-revolutionary period. Their economic opportunities had changed pretty dramatically. They saw Britain and Parliament and the King as something very different, as an enemy that they had vanquished, and now as some New Yorkers saw Britain as an ally, some saw it as a kind of threat to the stability of the United States. So in that regard, Irving was expressing New Yorkers' angst about how do we deal with this change, this very fundamental, very dramatic change in how we see ourselves and